The town of Black Creek has left its church to rot for 27 years. There is no power, no one to maintain the grounds, and no neighbors for miles. Yet every night at exactly 12 a.m., the rusted cast-iron bell in the tower swings. It strikes once, then the town returns to silence. Most residents grew accustomed to the nightly toll, treating the impossibility as a local quirk. But the sound of a bell ringing without a ringer is a mystery that eventually demands an investigation. Sheriff Daniel Carter arrived on a cold October night to settle the matter. He parked his patrol car in the tall grass, waiting to catch a trespasser in the act. He spent the hour before midnight verifying the building's security. Every window was sealed. The heavy front doors were locked tight from the outside. When the clock struck 12, the bell rang. As the sound echoed, the front doors unlatched and swung inward, opening into a hollow, pitch-black sanctuary. Daniel drew his service weapon and crossed the threshold. He left the world of standard police work behind, stepping into a freezing darkness that no flashlight could fully pierce. The air inside was heavy with the smell of old wood and stagnant dust. As Daniel moved his light over the broken pews, he heard a soft, rhythmic sound. It was the unmistakable cadence of someone breathing in the dark. He reached the altar and found a Bible caked in decades of grime. Only one page was clean, looking as though it had been printed that morning. It was open to Psalm 23. Daniel's light landed on the verse about walking through the valley of the shadow of death. This was a targeted message. The entity in the church was aware of Daniel's history, and it was using the scripture to acknowledge his arrival. A whisper drifted from the rafters, calling his name. The voice was a perfect replica of his daughter's. She had died 6 years ago. Daniel had spent those 6 years in a state of quiet rebellion. He was consumed by anger over his loss, which led him to abandon his faith and live in total spiritual isolation. He retreated upstairs, stumbling into a hallway lined with old photos. One showed Reverend Thomas, the man who vanished from this church 27 years earlier. Beneath his face, someone had scrawled, "He stopped listening." The bell rang again, this time at 12:13 a.m. The rules were changing. From the floor below, the sound of heavy, slow footsteps began to move towards the stairs, cornering him. The haunting was shifting into a personal assault. The entity was using Daniel's grief as a doorway, attempting to use his isolation to break his resolve. Daniel returned to the altar as a dark shadow stretched across the window reflections. The voice mocked him, telling him he was alone, and that his fear was proof of his abandonment. Daniel looked at his trembling hands and remembered his daughter's voice, not the whisper in the dark, but her actual words. She used to tell him that God stays close specifically when we are afraid. Daniel holstered his gun and picked up the Bible. He spoke into the cold air, audibly rejecting the idea that he was alone. He acknowledged his terror, but stated that the promise was companionship through the darkness, not an escape from it. The shadow recoiled as Daniel committed to that trust. The church interior suddenly filled with a brilliant golden light that burned through the freezing mist and silenced the whispers. Daniel survived the night by abandoning his own strength. He replaced his anger with a choice to trust God while the danger was still present. Deputies searched the church the following morning. They confirmed the building had no hidden machinery, no electrical current, and no signs of a squatter. Behind the altar, Daniel found a hidden wooden box. It contained a journal belonging to Reverend Thomas, the pastor who disappeared decades ago. The final entry provided the only explanation for the anomaly. If the bell rings after midnight, someone has forgotten that God is still listening. That night, the bell remained silent for the first time in 27 years. The spiritual distress signal had been answered by someone willing to listen again. Daniel returned home and prayed for the first time in 6 years. He realized that faith is the act of trusting God while experiencing fear, rather than waiting for the fear to vanish first. Sometimes God doesn't remove the darkness immediately. Sometimes He simply walks beside you through it. When you face your own midnight and the darkness begins to whisper, the natural instinct is to retreat. The harder, necessary choice is to move toward God. The darkest nights lose their power when you understand that you are never walking through them alone.